Have you ever heard a voice so raw and electrifying that it felt like it could tear right through the fabric of everyday life? That's the feeling many people had the first time they heard Janis Joplin. Even years later, it's hard to believe someone could walk into a room, open her mouth to sing, and change the atmosphere with such blistering authenticity and depth. It's the kind of impact that leaves you wanting to know more, not just about the performance, but about the human being behind that soulful wail. Today, let's take a journey into Janis Joplin's world from her youth on the Texas Gulf Coast to her final days as a rock icon. We'll dive into the complexities that shaped her, the stories that fueled her music, and the struggles that haunted her every step of the way. These recollections will draw us through heartbreak, celebration, scandal, and sorrow, all culminating in a legacy that continues to captivate music lovers of every generation. If you've ever felt drawn to someone who lived outside the lines, if you've ever been moved by the rebellious spirit of the 1960s, or if you've simply been mesmerized by raw talent that burns so hot it can scarcely be contained, you're in for an absorbing ride. We're about to meet the wild, brilliant, deeply vulnerable, and irreplaceable Janis Joplin. Born on January 19, 1943, Janis Lynn Joplin was the eldest child of Dorothy and Seth Joplin. She had younger siblings, Michael and Laura, and the household was, by most outward appearances, typical for the region. Her father worked at an oil refinery, and her mother was deeply interested in singing and even considered a career in music for herself before settling into family life. This might be one of the lesser-known pieces of the puzzle. Janis came from a home where music was more than just a passing pastime. It was something her mother genuinely appreciated, if not pursued with the same passion. Janis was exposed to creative influences early on, which might explain her quick inclination toward artistic expression. But there was a fundamental clash in her household, a tension that would define many of her decisions later in life. The Joplins valued a certain propriety and had their own expectations of how their children should grow up. Meanwhile, Janis felt out of step with the cultural norms pressed upon young girls at the time. She was talkative, confident in certain ways, and rebellious in others. She did not see herself as the quiet, obedient daughter content to become a standard Southern housewife. Instead, she wanted more freedom, more exploration, more life. By the time she was in high school, Janis was already developing a reputation for being different. It wasn't just that she dressed differently, but also that she thought differently and questioned things that her peers took at face value. In a town like Port Arthur, that could be social suicide. She was teased for her weight, her acne, her hair, for just about anything you can imagine. There's a heartbreaking anecdote that she was allegedly voted ugliest man on campus by some frat boys at the University of Texas at Austin. Though the absolute truth of this rumor remains uncertain, it's clear she endured vicious bullying that left deep emotional scars. It's an image that sticks with many fans because it seems so contrary to the roaring confidence she displayed on stage, and it serves as a stark reminder that her bravado was a shield as much as it was a genuine burst of individuality. In interviews much later, Janis herself hinted at the pain of these early years, mentioning that she felt ostracized, misunderstood, and terribly lonely. In Port Arthur, a woman was often expected to conform to a strict social template, and Janis realized early on that she was never going to fit in that mold. Tucked away in her bedroom during adolescence, Janis found solace in painting and reading. But most significantly, she discovered the blues, particularly the powerful voices of Bessie Smith and Big Mama Thornton. She was drawn to the unvarnished emotion these women poured into every note, the feeling that they were singing straight from the gut, from a place of real suffering and longing. It resonated with her in a way few things had before. She once said that Bessie Smith showed her the air and taught her how to fill it. This love of the blues led to her performing at local gatherings, parties, and eventually small clubs when she reached a point where she could stand in front of a crowd. That's when people started to notice that Janis Joplin had something truly special. Even if they didn't approve of her unconventional style, they couldn't deny the authenticity in her voice. By the early 1960s, Janis felt the pull to leave Texas behind. She wanted to be where the action was, where like-minded people might be found, and where the beatnik and hippie subcultures were taking root. She floated between Texas and San Francisco, attending college intermittently at Lamar State College of Technology and the University of Texas, at Austin, but her real passion was music, not academics. In 1963, she first tried her luck in San Francisco, an epicenter for artistic and social experimentation. The city's North Beach scene, filled with coffee houses, poetry readings, and folk clubs, was a siren call for a girl hungry for life outside the strict confines of the conservative South. She immersed herself in this bohemian enclave, meeting poets, musicians, and other misfits who, like her, were seeking a greater sense of freedom and purpose. The environment was exhilarating, but it also came with its share of dangers. Drugs were plentiful, and Janis, possessing an addictive personality, was immediately at risk. Her foray into substance use started innocently enough, usually involving drinking and experimenting with some of the lighter substances that were circulating. But San Francisco was, at the time, a kind of libertine Wild West. Heroin was present, as was methamphetamine, LSD, and every other substance that would form the backbone of the 1960s counterculture. Janis had not yet become a rock star, and she was still searching for acceptance. The same intensity she poured into music often spilled into her relationships with substances. She became known for her wild partying, but behind the wildness lingered a sense of desperation. This was still a young woman trying to belong somewhere. After a while, the scene took a toll on her health, and friends grew concerned. In 1965, deeply frail and anxious, Janis retreated back home to Port Arthur in an attempt to clean up and perhaps pursue a straighter path. She briefly tried to conform to a normal life again, even considering a major in sociology at Lamar. But the siren call of music and the stage was relentless. She couldn't stay away. A pivotal moment came when she got a call from Chet Helms, an influential figure in the San Francisco music scene. Helms was organizing a band called Big Brother and the Holding Company and needed a dynamic lead singer. Knowing Janis's exceptional talent, he reached out, and she agreed to give it another shot. By 1966, Janis was back in San Francisco, this time as the frontwoman for Big Brother and the Holding Company. The band was part of the emerging psychedelic rock movement in Haight-Ashbury, where the summer of love was just around the corner. It was an era unlike any other. Kaleidoscopic light shows, mind-expanding substances, revolutionary politics, and a collective yearning for love, peace, and communal living. Into this swirling mix stepped Janis Joplin, with a voice that could rip your soul right out of your chest. No one could ignore her, and the band quickly became a local sensation, performing at famed venues like the Avalon Ballroom and the Fillmore. It was in these halls that Janis was truly baptized into the world of rock music, finding a crowd that reveled in her unrestrained energy and left the band hungry for more. Their big break arrived with the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival, an event that is often cited as a launching pad for several iconic 60s acts. Janis took the stage with Big Brother and delivered a rendition of Ball and Chain that became the stuff of legend. Dressed in psychedelic bohemian clothing, She poured her entire being into each note. From the very first line, the crowd was stunned into a hushed awe, then, by the end, exploded into roaring applause. Mama Cass Elliot, watching from the audience, was famously seen mouthing, "Wow," after the performance. That's the moment Janis became a phenomenon. Almost overnight, the entire country was talking about that girl with the raw, bluesy voice. Industry bigwigs started paying attention, and it wasn't long before Columbia Records signed Big Brother and the holding company. Their album Cheap Thrills, released in 1968, soared to the top of the charts, fueled by tracks such as Piece of My Heart. The raw production and Janis's volcanic vocals captured the spirit of a generation. The cover art, drawn by underground artist Robert Crumb, also became iconic, a perfect visual representation of the psychedelic era. Despite her success with Big Brother, Janis began to feel limited by the band's musicianship and was eager to explore fresh, sonic territory. She parted ways with them in late 1968 and formed the Cosmic Blues Band, which allowed her to incorporate more soul and R&B elements into her music. However, internal conflicts, heavy drug use, and erratic performances plagued the new group. There were nights when Janis's voice would soar, mesmerizing the audience, and then there were gigs where she'd be too incapacitated or emotionally drained to deliver the performance everyone expected. That unpredictability became part of her legend. Friends and colleagues remember her as incredibly generous, passionate, and devoted to the music. When she was at her best, she could bring an audience to tears. But her personal life was complicated by an on-again, off-again relationship with heroin. And she drank heavily, favoring Southern comfort to the point of making it practically her trademark. She had love affairs with both men and women, and confided in friends that she found it hard to stay emotionally grounded in the midst of fame and addiction. She felt alone, even in the limelight, and the more success she gained, the more she seemed to need an escape. For Janis, 1969 was a whirlwind, culminating in an appearance at Woodstock. Although her Woodstock performance is remembered fondly today, she was not in top shape that night. By many accounts, she was out of tune, slurring, and clearly under the influence. The crowd was massive, and the entire festival had turned chaotic with rain, mud, and logistical nightmares. Still, her mere presence energized tens of thousands of people who recognized her as one of the reigning queens of rock. She took the stage late, well after midnight, and performed a set that might have lacked the polish of Monterey, but was still quintessentially Janis, loud, heartfelt, and defiant. She famously told the audience, "It's just up to us to have a good time," trying to rally both herself and the crowd through the exhaustion and the haze. In 1970, Janis formed the Full Tilt Boogie Band, perhaps the group best suited to her style. They clicked musically, and she seemed genuinely happy to be working with them. It was during these sessions that she recorded Pearl, an album that many now consider her masterpiece. The track list included Mercedes-Benz, recorded a cappella in a single take just days before her death. This bit of trivia is especially poignant because it emphasizes how sudden and devastating her passing was. She seemed in some ways to be on an upswing, more creatively energized, more confident in the band's synergy, even talking about future plans. Friends later recounted that Janis, just weeks before, had been in high spirits, discussing potential travel plans, brainstorming new musical directions, and even leaving phone messages to loved ones to reconnect. But her private demons were never fully conquered. On October 4th, 1970, Janis Joplin was found dead in her hotel room at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Los Angeles. The official cause was an accidental heroin overdose. She was 27 years old, a heartbreakingly young age, and thus joined the ranks of the now mythical 27 Club. The finality of that day still resonates through music history. The girl from Port Arthur who sang so fearlessly about heartbreak, loneliness, and love was gone, leaving behind questions about what might have been had she lived longer. Would she have overcome her addictions? Would she have explored new genres? Maybe collaborated with other major artists? The sorrow is in not knowing, and for her friends, family, and bandmates, it was a pain that would linger for years. To better understand Janis's journey, one has to look at the emotional threads that ran through her life. She was someone who craved validation in ways that only those who felt deeply ostracized can comprehend. Her music wasn't just a performance, it was a way of baring her soul, letting the audience hold her pain, and in turn, feeling that she was not alone. It's often overlooked that she had an extensive letter-writing habit. She corresponded with her parents and siblings, sometimes apologizing for her behavior, sometimes promising to do better. In one particularly emotional letter from Brazil, where she'd gone on holiday to try and center herself, she wrote that she was thinking about returning to school, about making a clean break from drugs, about finding a stable romantic partner. That letter is rarely discussed in mainstream tellings of her life, yet it reveals how deeply she yearned for normalcy, even as the stage called her name. People who knew her personally describe moments that break the stereotype of the hard-partying rock goddess. They tell stories of a Janis who giggled easily at silly jokes, who could be shy and uncertain when the lights went down, who was constantly seeking reassurance that she was truly loved for who she was underneath the wild image. She was known to give away some of her clothes to friends or even strangers she'd just met, telling them to enjoy the spirit of the times. She could be heartbreakingly generous, picking up the tab for an entire group of people at a bar, even if she had only met them that night, because she wanted everyone to feel the same sense of abundance and camaraderie that she felt when she was at her best. At the same time, she could be confrontational, especially if she felt disrespected or patronized. The contradictions were everywhere. She reveled in being a rock star, but sometimes felt crushed by the expectations it carried. She loved the applause, but loathed the prying eyes of the press. She celebrated independence, yet yearned for a traditional sense of belonging. One lesser-known story that offers insight into Janis's heart is about a brief period during which she tried to get sober in the late 1960s. She sought out supportive friends who weren't as deeply involved in the drug scene. For a short while, she attended some gatherings aimed at staying clean, even promising people that this time she was really going to do it. When she managed to stay off hard drugs, you could see her face regain color, her energy shift, and her voice become clearer. But the temptations of the road, the demands of touring, and her own emotional vulnerabilities invariably pulled her back. During this interval, she'd spoken earnestly about wanting to have a family someday and a white picket fence life. If only she could stop feeling like the entire world was against her. It's a deeply human portrait that contradicts the one-dimensional image of her as a perpetual party girl. Controversies naturally swirl around a figure as fiery as Janis Joplin. One of the debates centers on how her bandmates from Big Brother were sometimes overlooked or undervalued by the industry. Some historians argue that management and record label executives pushed Janis to leave Big Brother to mold her into a solo star, damaging friendships and possibly fracturing the synergy that made her early performances so electrifying. Others maintain that Janis's musical evolution required parting ways with a group that wasn't on the same technical level. There's also some disagreement about whether the media exaggerated her drug use in order to create a sensational story, overshadowing her artistry. Many of her close companions insist that while Janis certainly struggled with addiction, she was a far more complex person than the caricature of the eternally wasted rock singer. She was well-read, had strong opinions about politics and gender roles, and could hold court on topics ranging from literature to civil rights. These layers are often lost in mainstream retellings that focus primarily on her destructive behavior or untimely demise. Another point of historical contention revolves around her relationship with her hometown. Some portray Port Arthur as an oppressive environment that ridiculed and tormented Janis until she fled. Others note that the negative experiences may have been amplified over time, and that many classmates and townspeople remember Janis fondly. A handful even say they were proud of her achievements, though perhaps they didn't know how to express that pride in the midst of the cultural upheaval of the era. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, colored by Janis's perception of rejection and the undeniable reality of a conservative environment that clashed with her free-spirited nature. Still, Janis Joplin's influence on music and culture is indisputable. She remains one of the most revered figures in rock history, not just because of her flamboyant presence, but because her voice tapped into something primal. If you close your eyes and listen to Cry Baby or Summertime, you can almost feel the vibrations coursing through your chest, as if her raw emotion could literally reshape the molecules in the air. She popularized a style that blurred the lines between rock and the blues, paving the way for countless singers who wanted to express themselves without restraint. Women who might not have found an avenue for their grit and passion if not for Janis. She shattered perceptions of how a female rock singer was supposed to behave. She was not demure, not polished, not content with background vocals. She stood front and center, took command, and demanded the spotlight, effectively writing the playbook for the powerful female rock vocalist. Her continuing relevance can also be seen in the countless tributes and reinterpretations of her work. Festivals regularly host homage concerts, and young musicians still cover her songs in smoky bars, hoping to catch a fraction of that magic. Decades after her passing, she's been the subject of documentaries, biographical films, musicals, and endless magazine retrospectives. Even outside of music, her story has come to symbolize the pitfalls of fame and the tragic price that can come with unbounded freedom in an industry known for its brutal pressures. She was among the first of her era's superstars to die from a drug overdose, alongside contemporaries like Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison, whose deaths in a similarly condensed time frame underscored the darker side of the 1960s counterculture. But Janis's death didn't negate the joy and liberation that her music brought to so many. Instead, it forever etched into cultural memory the image of an artist burning so brightly that the flame could not last. What we learn from Janis Joplin's story might differ from person to person. Some will see it as a cautionary tale about excess and addiction. Others will take inspiration from her willingness to defy social norms, to be unapologetically herself at a time when conformity was the norm for young women in her hometown. There's the lesson about the perils of stardom, how being thrust into the national spotlight can feed insecurities if one doesn't have a strong support system. And there's the enduring idea that true artistry is an honest conversation between performer and audience, a raw exposure of one's deepest feelings that can be both cathartic and destructive. In the years since her passing, family members like her sister Laura have attempted to shed light on Janis as a person, beyond the sensational headlines. They talk about a woman who could be shy, who wrote postcards home from the road, who missed Texas even though she claimed to hate it. It's these contradictions that give her story a profoundly human dimension. She wasn't just a rock star, she was a living, breathing person with hopes, fears, and an almost aching desire to connect. She chased that feeling on stage, through substances, in relationships, and in letters to people she loved. And while she managed to find fleeting moments of intense connection, like the explosive bond she formed with the Monterey pop crowd, lasting fulfillment seemed to elude her. This tension resonates with listeners still because it reflects something universal. Many of us wrestle with the gap between how the world sees us and who we really are inside. There's another seldom talked about detail that speaks volumes about Janis's emotional generosity. In several instances, she quietly donated money to struggling musicians and friends without seeking any public acknowledgement. One friend recounted a time when Janis discovered they were behind on rent. She promptly handed over a few $100s, insisting that everyone deserves a place to live, especially if they're an artist trying to make it in the rough music scene. Stories like this rarely made the press in those days, overshadowed by tales of her rowdy partying and wild on-stage banter. But they remind us that Janis's spirit was fueled by empathy, even if her own life was a storm she struggled to navigate. Her style, loose-fitting dresses, feather boas, and unruly hair, also left an imprint on rock fashion. Though it might seem casual, it was a deliberate expression of personal freedom. She dressed for comfort and drama simultaneously, establishing a precedent for female performers who didn't want to be constrained by traditional, gender-specific stage attire. She was as likely to wear bell-bottoms and men's shirts as she was to strut around in a tattered scarf and psychedelic mini dress. In all of these choices, she conveyed that she belonged to no one but herself. Even critics who took issue with her, sometimes off-key or screaming approach, eventually came around to recognizing that something unique was happening with her music. She embodied the spirit of the times, rowdy, rebellious, heartfelt, communal, and painfully aware of the world's injustices. She saw in the blues not just a style of singing, but an entire emotional language that allowed her to tell the truth about her pain. It's no surprise that decades after her passing, younger artists who cover her songs often realize that to sing a Janis Joplin tune properly, you have to be prepared to give more than your voice. You have to give a part of your soul. Of course, in the aftermath of her death, many pointed fingers at the culture of the era. Some blamed the so-called free love, free drugs ethos for leading promising young talents into fatal addictions. Others blamed the music industry itself, which capitalized on rebellious images without providing the necessary support systems for artists who were basically thrown into an endless cycle of touring, recording, and partying. Some placed the blame on Janis herself, citing personal responsibility. The truth is undoubtedly multifaceted. There's a confluence of factors, cultural, personal, familial, and biological, that contributed to her downward spiral. But focusing solely on her final days risks overshadowing the magnitude of her contribution to music and the emotional catharsis she offered countless fans. There's a reason her records still sell, why people continue to be drawn to her story, and why her voice hasn't faded into obscurity. In recent years, some surprising details have surfaced that challenge long-standing assumptions about Janis's final days. For instance, some who knew her well have suggested that she was turning a corner in her private life, hinting at a more stable and bright future, maybe even a plan to settle into a calmer lifestyle. According to a few anecdotal reports, she was considering working with new producers on a more blues-heavy record, doubling down on her roots. She had also planned a birthday bash for a close friend, a sign of emotional investment in the future. Small signals, perhaps, but they complicate the narrative that her end was inevitable. It's these nuances that make her story all the more tragic. Just as she found a band that clicked, just as she talked about returning to a simpler life, tragedy struck. It's a reminder of how fragile life is and how easily the best laid plans can be overturned by a single misstep. Her historical significance extends beyond music, too. As one of the first female rock stars to achieve mainstream acclaim, she challenged gender norms that were still rigid in the 1960s. She wasn't just a token woman in a band. She was the focal point, the reason people came to see Big Brother, and later, her solo acts. She set a precedent for future generations of female rockers who refused to be relegated to background roles. Janis Joplin, in her short life, paved the way for so many others, from Stevie Nicks and Ann Wilson to modern artists like Beth Hart, and even pop stars who incorporate rock elements in their performances. Her influence radiates through the decades, a testament to how a single individual's authenticity can ignite lasting change. And so, after all these words, what do we take away from Janis Joplin's legacy? Perhaps it's an appreciation for the delicate line between artistic brilliance and personal vulnerability. Maybe it's a reminder to honor the unique gifts we each carry, even if they don't fit neatly into societal expectations. Or perhaps it's a caution to be vigilant about how the pressures of life and success can lead us down perilous paths if we're not careful. On a deeper level, Janis reminds us of the startling power of authenticity. She achieved a profound connection with her audience, not by being perfect or refined, but by being unflinchingly real. In a world that often tries to tame and tidy up the rough edges, Janis Joplin's life stands as both a celebratory cry for freedom and a somber call for self-care. For anyone who hears her recordings for the first time today, the impression is immediate. Here is a person whose voice is a conduit for something much bigger. It's as if she's channeling every heartbreak and triumph that ever existed. And that's the crux of her appeal. She reminds us, even now, that when we stop hiding and let all our pent-up feelings be heard, something miraculous can happen. We discover our shared humanity, our capacity to understand each other's pain and joy in ways words alone might never communicate. That's the gift she gave during her lifetime, and it's one that persists long after the final note of "Me and Bobby McGee" fades. Janis Joplin's story may be short, but it gleams with intensity. It's a testament to the power of self-expression in a world that doesn't always welcome difference. She wrestled with insecurities, with the suffocating expectations of her hometown, and ultimately with the harsh realities of the music business and her own addictive impulses. But even with all the hardship, she made her mark, pushing boundaries and opening doors for countless others who wanted to pour their souls into their art. In the end, it's impossible to reduce her to a single narrative. She was an amalgam of bravado and vulnerability, both a pioneer and a warning, a free spirit who sometimes felt trapped, and a beacon of possibility that still lights up the musical firmament. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.